Welcome back to the DVD series on the resurrection of Jesus. We're talking about the case for the resurrection, and we're trying to build a case as historians. For the last few weeks, we've been trying to make the case ourselves that you can make a historic case for the resurrection. We believe the resurrection to be the central element, not just a central element, not just kind of important, but the most important element of Christianity. If it is true, then Christianity is true. If it is false, then Christianity is false. All dominoes, as I sometimes say, I don't know if you like the term dominoes, but I do. All dominoes fall out from the resurrection of Jesus. Mike Licona, historian, really focused upon the historicity of the resurrection, wrote a book on the resurrection, 700-page book just dealing with the how can a historian look at an event such as the resurrection? How can we as Christians be responsible? So far we've gone through and talked about the why, we've talked about the sources, the what, and then now we're trying to bring together and say, okay, with all of these things, with all of these sources, last week 3 minimal facts or bedrock facts, you call it.
Historical bedrock.
Name real quick, as a review, what are the historical bedrock facts that you and I can rest our head upon, and then let's talk about what are the options.
Okay. There are basically 3 facts that virtually all historians agree upon, whether they're Christian, conservative, liberal, Jewish, agnostic, atheist. They all agree on these. Number 1 is Jesus' death by crucifixion. Number 2, shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences that they believed were the risen Jesus appearing to them. And number 3, there was a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, who had an experience that led to his conversion because he believed the risen Jesus had appeared to him.
Okay. Having said that, here's the core of what we want to get to today. Implications. Or the options that are open as a historian. You're looking at that and you say, okay, where do I go now? Is it automatically just a belief in what they said is true, or do we have other options? And let's name some of those as a historian.
Yeah, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take those 3 facts, okay, and they're going to create somewhat of a filter. Imagine a funnel, all right, and then we're going to formulate hypotheses of what may have happened to account for these facts. And we're going to put that hypothesis, each hypothesis in the funnel, and you've got a filter there. The first filter is, can that hypothesis account for all 3 facts?
Okay. The
second filter, can it account for them without forcing those facts to fit or without excessive ambiguity? Third, can the hypothesis account for those facts without a lot of speculation or improvisation? And finally, can the hypothesis account for those facts as long as that hypothesis is compatible with other widely accepted facts or knowledge? And we'll see what comes through there. So when you pour the resurrection hypothesis in there, it comes through at least 3 of those filters. It doesn't fail the 4th, which is the plausibility, an alignment with other widely accepted knowledge. Why? Because we know dead people don't rise. They don't come back to life, at least by natural causes. The problem is that if Jesus rose from the dead, it was a unique event, almost certainly by a deity for a specific purpose. And all our experience tells us is that dead people stay dead apart from an act of God. But if God existed and wanted to raise Jesus, well then it's very probable, I think everybody would agree, it's very probable that Jesus would be raised. The problem is as historians, we can't know ahead of time whether God would want to raise Jesus. So in terms of that 4th filter, it's kind of not applicable to the resurrection hypothesis. You really can't determine one way or the other.
You mean compatibility with what we know about God and whether or not he would want to raise Jesus?
No, with other widely accepted knowledge.
And widely accepted knowledge at this point being scientific.
Yeah, that people don't come back to life.
Okay.
Agreed, they don't come back to life by natural causes, but if Jesus rose, it wasn't by natural causes. Nobody ever said he rose raised by natural causes, so it doesn't apply. It's like, using a telescope to detect cancer. It's the wrong tool. So resurrection comes through pretty well with that.
So you're saying that the resurrection hypothesis put through this filters, does it account for all the known facts? Yes, it does.
Yep.
Okay. Everything that we know and all the sources that we looked at, if the resurrection actually happened, then it makes sense. This is exactly what you would expect.
Right.
And is it not forced?
Right. It's not forced. Yeah.
Not forced through any type of grid to make the resurrection happen, but that's kind of the, again, naturalistic.
Well, it
way.
has to do with the reports are that Jesus was raised bodily. You don't have to force any interpretation of the resurrection there to make it fit.
Yeah, yeah. And what was the third filter one more time?
That would be what's called less ad hoc. Are there any is any improvisation or speculation involved? At most, one could say, well, you're speculating. You have to speculate that God exists.
Okay.
But, it's basically a non-evidenced assumption. But God's existence is not non-evidenced, as you know.
Yeah.
There's good evidence for God's existence from philosophy and science to show that there's an intelligent first cause designer of the universe who seemed to purpose that the universe and life would exist.
Well, the thing that's very interesting, too, about what we're talking about here is if the resurrection did happen, that's evidence for God in and of
It's
itself.
further, yeah, but you don't want to argue in a circle. But
I want to argue in a circle.
I agree.
I think that if you prove that the resurrection happened historically, though, you got at least another evidence for God.
Oh, probably the strongest evidence for God, in my opinion. But you don't presuppose God's existence to get there.
Okay,
Gotcha.
gotcha.
It's evidence
So you're
that God
saying here
exists.
then that if it works through this filter, the resurrection hypothesis works through this filter perfectly, unless you start with the assumption that God can't exist, so therefore it can't work through
That's
that.
exactly right. I think it's the responsibility of the historian to make no presuppositions. You don't presuppose God's exist, and you don't presuppose that he doesn't exist. You take a position of openness and you let the facts speak for themselves.
So number one, from a historian standpoint, God exists, or God seems to have risen Jesus from the grave. Perfectly historically plausible. There's not a element of theology coming in at that point, but it may produce theology.
Yes.
But it's just
It's the theological implications of the resurrection.
Exactly. Okay, so let's say, but wait a minute, as a historian, you've got to look at other options.
Yep.
Besides just what it seems to be that Jesus rose from the grave. What are some other options we got?
Well, over the years, a number of them have come up. For example, the disciples stole the body. But that's hardly anyone. I don't know of anyone today who embraces that view. And the reason being is because it's so strongly or well established that Jesus' disciples sincerely believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and had appeared to them. So because we know that the disciples actually believed that Jesus was raised, you can't have a stolen body because they would know he wasn't there.
That was the first theory that was put forth in the church, right?
Yeah, by Matthew.
Yeah.
Disciples stole the body. But the thing
Not
is...
by Matthew, but recorded by Matthew.
Right, recorded by Matthew, I'm sorry. So the thing is, though, we also know that these disciples were willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for their beliefs. Liars make poor martyrs. So the fact that they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs shows that they sincerely believed it. Now someone would say, but wait a minute, Mike, we're all aware of Muslim terrorists who are willing to die for their beliefs today. Doesn't mean that Islam is true. Agreed. But they die for the cause of Islam because they believe Islam is true. That's what we're saying here. These guys aren't dying because they're insincere. They're dying because they sincerely believe that Islam is true. The disciples, by willing to suffer continuously and willing to die, this demonstrates that they sincerely thought that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them. And by the way, that's different. We may die for what we believe is true, but for all we know, may not be. Muslims today may die for what they believe is true, but for all they know, it may not be. The disciples were dying for what they knew was either true or false.
I wouldn't die
Big difference.
as an eyewitness of the foundational event that establishes it. I would just die as a sincere believer. So
Exactly.
Very good point, because people will bring that up quite a bit. So stolen body, if we were to say that, I would say that it takes a greater leap of faith to believe in the stolen body as a historian than to believe that the resurrection happened.
Yeah, I would say
There's
so.
no evidence.
Yeah, there's no evidence. And I don't know anyone who would posit that today, a scholar at least.
Next theory.
The apparent death theory. This would be one that would say Jesus didn't really die. They thought he was dead on the cross. They took him off, buried him. He revived by the coolness of the tomb, showed himself alive afterward, and people thought he had been raised.
Called this the swoon theory.
It's been called the swoon theory, swoon theory, apparent death theory. But, no, in fact, in my studies, I only found maybe a handful of people at most in the entire universe who today would think that's even possible that happened. And it's because of what we know about crucifixion. It was an amazingly and incredibly cruel process. And in fact, Josephus reports, he's the only one to report of a person surviving crucifixion. But of that, there were 3 of his friends he saw crucified. He went to the Roman commander Titus and reported this to him and asked as a favor that they be removed from their crosses. Titus, as a favor to Josephus, removed all 3 and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. In spite of this, 2 of the 3 still died. So even if Jesus was removed prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival were very small. But the fact is, we don't have any evidence that Jesus was removed while alive or that he was provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. And there's so many things we could say about the apparent death theory. One last thing, though, I'd say is, if Jesus had been assisted medically and came forth a couple of days later, what would he look like? He might convince his disciples that he was alive, but he'd never convince them that he was the risen Prince of Life. They would have wanted to get him a doctor. He would have been limping. He would have been in horrible shape. So there's just no way that this can account for the known historical
It doesn't
facts.
make it through these filters. I'm looking at the filters. Does it count for the information? Is it not forced? All of these are forced, ad hoc. I mean, it's coming up with something just to come up with something without any, and here's the point, these so far have no historic grounds whatsoever.
None.
Okay, so we've got 2 alternatives that go through this filter: stolen body, apparent death theory. Neither one of them really make it through the filter. Is there any more that need to be covered?
Well, certainly the hallucination hypothesis, because that is the most popular one offered by skeptics today.
Okay.
That, they didn't really see Jesus, they all experienced grief hallucinations.
And explain that to me. I mean, what is the argument that is... First of all, not so much what is the argument made that is being out there. As a historian, do you have to consider this as being a viable alternative?
Of course, you got to consider just about anything that's raised.
Okay, so we're saying that all of these guys that we know, they think they saw Jesus, they believe they saw Jesus, they go to death for saying they saw Jesus, dead and buried and rose from the grave, and now we're saying, well, maybe they just hallucinated.
Right.
Maybe they had, are we talking about a dream? What is a hallucination?
Well, hallucination, technically speaking, is a false sensory perception. You perceive something with one of your senses, something that isn't really there.
Okay.
So you could have an auditory hallucination where you think you hear something, but it's not really there, nothing's making the noise. A visual hallucination where you perceive with your sight something, but it's not really there.
Okay.
An olfactory hallucination, smell something. Gustatory, you taste something. There's also what's called a kinesthetic hallucination, where most of us have experienced a kinesthetic hallucination. We've all had experiences, that's motion, where you feel you're in motion. So have you ever been awakened in the middle of the night or in the morning because you felt you were falling off a building or a cliff or something? That is a kinesthetic hallucination. Okay. And then there's a tactile hallucination, where you feel something is touching you, but it's really not. A lot of people have experienced that. Myself, I have as well. Those of us who have mobile phones, smartphones, and we have it so that if an email comes in, or even just a phone call, it will vibrate. If we have it vibrate without sound. Well, when we first got that phone, we might have it for an email coming in, and it vibrated, or a text, and we go, nothing. It's a false alarm. Yeah. That is a tactile hallucination. Most hallucinations are experienced in a single mode. Unless you're schizophrenic or on drugs, majority of hallucinations, almost all, occur in a single mode. In other words, you felt your cell phone, but you didn't feel and hear it. Okay. As a hallucination. So that's what a hallucination is.
Now, the first thing that I would think of whenever I'm thinking of this historically, I would say, okay, if we're going to throw in these alternatives, what are some parallels to that? I want to dig a little bit more into the hallucinations, but I would think to myself, is this common to have, these events of the past where we explain them away historically as hallucinations? Do we have any parallels to where we'd say throughout history, whenever Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the castle doors of Wittenberg, maybe not a great story or a great example because there is a little bit of question about that, but everybody says that it happened, but we've all determined that it was a hallucination. Just like whenever we had in the Roman Empire, you had the story about Julius Caesar dying, but that was all hallucination.
Yeah, the thing is, we have, let's talk about group hallucinations, okay? Because hallucinations are private experiences in the mind of an individual.
Okay, private and individual.
Yeah, it's kind of like dream.
Okay.
Like a dream. It's in your head, it's not really occurring. You can't make me have your dream, and I can't come into your head and experience that dream with you. We might have similar dreams, but we're not communicating with each other inside the dream for real.
I've never personally experienced where I had a dream and I go and tell it to someone and they said, I had the exact dream in every detail or something like that.
Yeah, or you said, like, here's an example I give. I can't wake up in the middle of the night and say to my wife, honey, I just had this dream, I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation.
Yeah.
You can't do that,
yeah.
Okay? So hallucinations are the same thing in terms of their private mental experiences. You can't share it with another person.
Okay.
All right, now, with that in mind, think about this. The reports are that, like the earliest reports, he appeared to Peter. Okay, so Peter it would have required him to have a visual hallucination. All right, we got to consider that as a possibility. Especially if the Gospels are correct. He's feeling guilty for denying him 3 times, and he's sorrowful, he's grieving because his master has been brutally executed. Then he appeared to the 12. Now we're looking at a group experience here. And here's the thing. They're all experienced. He appeared to them. So what kind of hallucination would that have to be? A visual hallucination. The most recent comprehensive work on the subject of hallucinations is written by 2 professionals in this area, Ailman and Laurie, and in a book titled Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception, published by the American Psychological Association in 2008. And I contacted those authors and I said, tell me, why didn't you talk about group hallucinations in there? He said, well, we really couldn't find much at all in the professional literature on it. They just seem very unlikely. And you think about this for a moment. In the book, they do describe that the group that is most likely, its members are most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And in multiple studies, roughly about 50% of them experience a hallucination of their loved one. But the majority of those hallucinations are, they experience them as a sense that they're present in the room, but they don't smell them or see them or hear them or anything. Visual hallucinations only make up 7% of all senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And that's the highest percentage, 7%. 100% of the apostles, the disciples, would have had to experience a visual hallucination. That's unheard of. It's unthinkable. They would have all had to have done it in a group setting. In other words, 100% simultaneously visual hallucination and of Jesus. That would take a whole lot of faith, especially since we really don't have anything in the psychological records to show that that's the case. And hallucinations don't account for the appearance to Paul. He's not grieving. Jesus is the last person in the world he would want to see. So the hallucination hypothesis lacks explanatory scope. It can't explain group appearances. It can't explain the appearance of Paul. Lacks explanatory power, etc. It's just a bad hypothesis.
We've been looking at this, and we went through the different options. And, I challenge you all to look at this as well and be historians yourselves and come up with alternatives and put it through this filter that we have. Does it account for the information? Is it forced? Is it ad hoc? You're coming up with it. And is it compatible with other worldviews? And I think that what we're going to find is, in the end, everything has to be forced. Hallucinations or Jesus didn't really die, forced so much that it takes such a great deal of blind faith and really it has nothing to do with history.
Yeah,
I mean,
if you're going to choose a naturalistic explanation, you're doing so on theological or for theological or philosophical reasons, not historical
you're
ones.
not doing it as a historian. You're doing it as a philosopher or a theologian. Great word, because that's how strong it is. That's how strong the historical case is. It points to the resurrection. It points to that being the not only the most plausible of all of them, but the most compelling of all of them. That I think obligates us morally to make the choice and say, Jesus Christ did indeed raise from the grave. So we'll continue this discussion next time, but it's been great to pick the mind of historians and learn from history about this.